Welcome back, kids. I hope everybody's staying safe at homes. Today's topic is financial management of disaster related economic losses. In the previous class, we have learned the definition of climatic change and its characteristics and how the temperature rises have substantial impacts on the globe, and we have seen the role of climatic change in the disaster risk and its reduction. In the present lecture, I hope by the end of this lecture, you will be able to classify the impacts of the disaster into direct, indirect, and secondary impacts. And you'll be able to list the basic steps of risk management and also the techniques for treating the loss exposures. We will see in detail now. As we all know that the natural disasters result in significant damage in social and also economic structures of the developing countries. That's not only the natural disasters, even we take the present example of COVID-19. With the onset of COVID-19, we are seeing a huge decline in the economic status of most of the developing countries and also the so-called developed countries. The damage is not only limited to the human lives, but also includes physical in case of natural disasters, environmental, social, and in long run economic also. If we want to have a speedy recovery of our country, we are supposed to aim at having efficient management of our finances. After all, everything revolves around money. If we do have a very good financial structure, then we hope we can have a very speedy recovery from the disasters. To cope up with the impact of the disaster, an efficient risk financing mechanism is always required. Risk financing mechanism. One such technique is risk management. So risk management is a mechanism which is generally a type of risk financing mechanisms. We will see what risk management is. We will start with the impacts of disasters. We will consider right now the natural disasters. The natural disasters basically they will be having a large amount of, they will create a large amount of impact on, as we have seen, physical or structural, environmental, social, and economic aspects. And these impacts are classified into direct, indirect, and secondary effects. The direct impacts are the damage to human and physical assets, which means that the damage which directly or instantly happens. It will be majorly due to the physical assets and also to the humans. So whatever the impacts which do happen immediately after the onset of the disaster come under direct impacts. See the list there. You see the loss of life, infrastructure damage, energy loss, communication interruption, transportation interruption. These do happen immediately after the onset of the disaster. So that's why these are called as the direct impacts. And coming to the indirect impacts. If the impact of the disaster is perceived in a time period which lasts from weeks to months, which means that we are experiencing the aftermath of a disaster. Let us suppose after 1 week to let us suppose 1 month, then these impacts are called as indirect impacts. Which means that we take an example. Let us suppose if our country is hit by an earthquake, the immediate direct impacts will be loss of human lives, infrastructure damage, transportation, and telephone facilities damage, and the stocks immediately they will fall down, the business stocks. So like that, there will be direct impacts. On the other hand, in the long run, let us suppose in the short long run, or maybe a 1 week or 1 month, if we consider because of the damage, the next will be the promoters or the investors from other countries. They show, or the interest which they show, it will be decreasing. So we will experience a loss of investment, and there will be loss of earnings, and we see huge unemployment prevailing in the country after the disasters. And because there is a transportation damage, we will see increased expenses of both private and public services, and there will be a loss of productivity, and operational costs rises, and there will be a consecutive tax changes also. So these will happen after 1 week or 1 month of a disaster. So that's why these are considered as indirect impacts. Now, if the impacts persist for very long durations, let us suppose for a year or so, even after the aftermath of, even after the onset of a disaster, then these are considered to be secondary impacts. Few of that impacts include the impact on the GDP of the country, or the total tax revenues of the government. If a disaster happens, then the people may not be ready to pay the taxes. So on the whole, on the long run, the country may not get sufficient tax revenues, and thereby this shows a direct implication on the GDP. So what will happen? If there is no proper GDP, maintaining of GDP, then automatically inflation rises, which means cost of living rises. So if inflation rises, which means that there is an increase in prices of the commodities, which means the country is moving into economic crisis. So what will happen? There will be, the payments will be denied, so there will be a balance of the payments. Trade deficits will be happening. More amount of debts we are supposed to take from the other countries or from financial organizations. So this will surely affect the export and import rates and our currency. So it's a long process. So direct impacts is what we see physically. Indirect impacts happening for 1 month. In the long run, every country is going to surely suffer from the disasters. So collectively, what we can say, all these impacts basically, they are having adverse effects on the social and economic development of a country. So the important key things here, the adverse effects are being met in the employment, housing, the factors of production, the 4 factors of the production, the income of the government, and if the tax revenues are not collected properly, then there will be a reallocation of expenditure. And at the same time, this disasters, let us suppose if you take a developing country, if the country is having lack of resources, shortage of resources, and if a disaster happens, then automatically what happens? The losses are particularly damaged by depriving the sources, by depriving these countries of their economic and other resources. So already they are developing countries. They are already keeping all their money for improving their economic positions and social positions. If a disaster happens, and all that money which is being kept for the development, it is to be utilized for the aftermath of a disaster. So there will be a huge decline in the resources which are being made by the governments. So that's why it's always said that the disasters will hinder the economic growth of developing countries much higher when compared to the developed countries. Moving on, as we have already seen, the disaster is always a development issue because we don't know when a disaster happens, and if it happens, it will surely hinder the development in one or the other ways. See that the disasters always and also cause potential declines in the revenue, as we have seen earlier. It was a secondary impact, and it hinders or it reduces the interest of the investors, as it was also one of the secondary impacts and indirect impacts. So, as a result of low investments from the other people, from the other governments, or from the other countries, or from the people from the other countries, the government's ability to invest in development projects reduces. So, this will result in long-term process, this will result in reallocation of the expenditure. That's what we have been discussing so far. So, responding to disasters, what is happening right now in COVID-19 also, responding to disasters also undermines the budgetary planning and also this investment confidence, and it interrupts ongoing projects and reduces the abilities of the community. So, we are supposed to carefully estimate the losses of a disaster, and we are supposed to plan for that. So, one such mechanism is the risk management. How to manage the risks which we encounter because of a disaster. So, risk management is the process of identifying and selecting the most appropriate techniques for treating the loss exposures. It includes four basic steps. The first one, identification of potential losses. You first identify what are the significant losses are. The second one is evaluation of those losses. The third one is selection of appropriate techniques for treating these losses. And lastly, implementation and administration of a program. See, once again, you identify the loss, evaluate that one, you choose the proper technique for treating that one, and next, once you choose the technique, you try to implement that one and administer that program. So, very simple procedure. So, what are the various techniques for treating the loss exposures? As we have seen, the third point here in the risk management is selection of appropriate techniques. Now, we will go with what is the best technique for assessing the losses. One is the risk control, where there are different techniques in risk control. One is avoidance, loss prevention, and loss control. For the avoidance, which means that we are going to avoid the disaster rather than happening it. So, one such one is, if you find difficulty in getting a divorce, better don't get married. So, this is a simple thing. So, avoiding the disaster to happen. The next one is loss prevention. If you want to go for driving, if you are driving, let us suppose if you don't want to get a challan on you, then automatically what happens? To prevent that loss, that taxes, that fines, you are supposed to take safe driving courses and drive defensively. That's the best way. So, either you avoid the disaster or you go with the loss prevention, or better you go with the loss control. And next is risk financing. One is retention, and next is non-insurance transfers. The last one is a commercial insurance. So, whatever happens to you, you are supposed to insure yourselves. That is the best way, providing financing for your losses. So, that's it regarding the conclusions. As we have seen, the impacts are basically classified into direct, indirect, and secondary based upon the time which we experience. And disaster is always a development issue, and it causes potential declines in the revenue. And the loss which is incurred due to the disasters can be treated using appropriate techniques like risk management. What we have seen is risk control and risk finance. Thank you. We will see in the next class about risk management.